Marcus Vale stepped through the rusted fence surrounding St. Margaret's Hospital, his German shepherd, Ranger, hesitating behind him. The abandoned building loomed in the October rain. Behind him, his German shepherd mix, Ranger, hesitated at the threshold, his amber eyes reflecting the dying light of dusk as they fixed on the towering brick facade that loomed before them like a monument to abandonment. "Come on, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Just for tonight. Just until we figure out what's next." If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. This investigation is just getting started, and I need to know if you want me to keep digging deeper. The town of Millbrook had whispered about St. Margaret's for the better part of a decade. Once the crown jewel of their small Pennsylvania community, the hospital had served 3 generations before closing its doors in 2014 amid what the newspapers called financial irregularities. But the real story, the one that lived in hushed conversations at Jimmy's Diner and echoed through the aisles of Miller's hardware store, was darker than simple bankruptcy. People spoke of screams heard in the middle of the night, of strange lights moving through empty corridors, of a cover-up so vast that it had tentacles reaching into the mayor's office, the county courthouse, and perhaps beyond. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts, but as he stepped through the hospital's main entrance, the heavy doors creaking open with surprising ease, he felt something settle into his bones. Not fear exactly, but recognition. This place knew suffering, it knew secrets, and it knew how to keep them. The lobby stretched before them like the rib cage of some massive beast, its marble floors cracked and stained, its crystal chandeliers hanging at odd angles where their chains had snapped. Rain leaked through a dozen places in the ceiling, creating a percussion symphony that echoed off the walls. Ranger padded beside Marcus, his claws clicking against the damaged marble, his nose working overtime to process the cocktail of scents that 16 months of abandonment had layered into every surface. Before we dive deeper into Marcus's discovery, I need just 30 seconds of your time. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell because what Marcus finds next will blow your mind. Trust me, the time you invest in this story will be worth every second. Marcus had been living rough for 8 months now, not by choice but by circumstance. A cascade of misfortunes that had started with his discharge from the army. But tonight was different. Tonight, the temperature was dropping toward freezing, and Ranger had developed a cough that worried Marcus more than his own empty stomach. The dog had found him during his 2nd week on the streets, appearing one morning like an answer to a prayer Marcus hadn't realized he'd been praying for. Ranger was a survivor too, scarred from what looked like dogfighting, suspicious of strangers, loyal to a fault once trust was earned. They understood each other in the wordless way that broken things often do. The hospital's directory still hung on the wall behind the reception desk, its white letters on black felt somehow more ominous in the gathering darkness. Emergency department, surgical suites, pediatric ward, psychiatric unit, radiology. Each department is a universe of stories, of lives saved and lost, of hopes realized and dreams deferred. But something about the layout struck Marcus as odd. The psychiatric unit was listed as being on the 4th floor, which seems strange for a department that would typically require ground-level access for ambulances and emergency situations. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, running his hand along Ranger's damp fur. "4th floor sound good to you? Probably better insulation up there." They found the stairwell easily enough. The elevators were dead, their doors sealed with industrial tape that bore the logo of Cromwell Security Services, a company Marcus didn't recognize, but whose name sent a small shiver of unease down his spine. The stairs were concrete and steel, built to last, and their footsteps created a rhythm that seemed to bounce ahead of them into the darkness above. By the time they reached the 4th floor, both man and dog were breathing hard. The psychiatric unit's double doors stood open, revealing a corridor that stretched into shadows punctuated by the occasional emergency light powered by backup batteries that somehow still functioned after all these years. The first thing that struck Marcus was how different this floor felt from the lobby. Where the lower levels bore the typical signs of abandonment, graffiti, broken fixtures, evidence of scavengers and urban explorers, this floor seemed almost preserved. The walls were cleaner, the fixtures intact, the nurses' station still equipped with computer monitors and filing cabinets that looked as though their occupants had simply stepped away for a coffee break and never returned. Ranger's behavior changed as they moved deeper into the unit. His ears pricked forward, his tail held high but not wagging, his head turning towards sounds that Marcus couldn't hear. The dog had always been sensitive to things beyond human perception, and Marcus had learned to trust those instincts. They found what looked like a break room near the end of the corridor. It still had furniture, a couch that had seen better days but was dry and relatively clean, a small kitchenette with cabinets that might contain useful supplies, windows that looked out over the town's scattered lights like fallen stars. Marcus tested the couch with his weight, felt it hold, and allowed himself to sit down for the first time in hours. "This'll do for tonight," Marcus said to Ranger, who had begun a systematic exploration of the room, nose to the ground, following scent trails that told stories Marcus could only imagine. As Marcus dug into his backpack for the last of his canned food, a tin of beef stew that would have to serve as dinner for both of them, he noticed something that made him pause. The break room's bulletin board still held notices and announcements, their edges curled with age, but their content still legible. Most were routine, shift schedules, policy updates, reminders about proper documentation. But one notice, smaller than the others and partially hidden behind a larger memo, caught his attention. It was a handwritten note dated just 2 weeks before the hospital's closure. "If anyone asks about the Meridian project files, you don't know anything. Management directive, no exceptions. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, Chief of Psychiatry." Marcus stared at the note for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. He'd seen enough cover-ups in the military to recognize the smell of one, and this note reeked of secrets that someone had been desperate to keep buried. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through the night. Police or ambulance, it was impossible to tell. The town of Millbrook slept uneasily below them, its residents secure in their homes, trusting in locks and alarm systems and the thin blue line that separated order from chaos. But Marcus knew better than most how fragile that illusion of safety could be. He'd seen what happened when the systems people trusted most revealed themselves to be built on foundations of lies. Ranger finished his exploration and settled onto the floor beside the couch, his head resting on his paws but his eyes remaining alert. The dog's presence was a comfort Marcus hadn't expected when he'd first started living on the streets. In Afghanistan, the medics had always said that healing happened faster when patients weren't alone. Maybe that was true for more than just physical wounds. As Marcus shared the canned stew with Ranger, using his fingers to portion out the meat and vegetables onto a paper plate he'd found in the kitchenette, he found his gaze returning to that handwritten note on the bulletin board. The Meridian Project, Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne. Files that someone had been worried enough about to issue written warnings to the staff. The smart thing would be to ignore it. Marcus had learned in the military that curiosity could be a fatal character flaw, especially when it came to matters that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. He had enough problems of his own without borrowing trouble from ghosts of bureaucratic cover-ups. But something about this place, about the way it seemed to hold its breath in the darkness, made him feel like he was meant to be here, like there was a reason that of all the abandoned buildings in Millbrook, he and Ranger had chosen this one for shelter. As the night deepened around them, Marcus lay back on the couch and stared up at the water-stained ceiling. Ranger's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, but the dog's muscles remained coiled, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. It was a state Marcus recognized from his own military training,
the ability to rest while remaining perpetually alert, to find moments of peace within landscapes of potential threat. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would focus on practical matters: food, employment prospects, perhaps another attempt to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of veteran services. Tonight was just about survival, about making it through another night with his dignity and his four-legged companion intact. But even as he tried to quiet his mind, Marcus found himself thinking about Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne and the Meridian Project files she'd been so worried about. In the darkness of the abandoned psychiatric unit, surrounded by the detritus of institutional secrets, he couldn't shake the feeling that some stories refused to stay buried, no matter how deep their graves. The rain continued its lonely vigil against the windows, and in its rhythm, Marcus heard echoes of other storms, other nights when he'd waited for dawn while surrounded by the wreckage of things that should have remained hidden. St. Margaret's Hospital kept its secrets well, but Marcus Vale had spent years learning how to read between the lines of official silences. And despite every instinct that told him to look away, to mind his own business, to focus on his own survival, he found himself drawn deeper into the mystery of this place and the shadows it had been built to hide. Dawn arrived like a reluctant witness, pale light filtering through the grimy windows of the psychiatric unit's break room. Marcus woke to the sound of Ranger's labored breathing, the dog's cough having worsened overnight. Each rasp sent a spike of worry through Marcus's chest, a familiar tightness that reminded him of watching wounded soldiers fight for breath in field hospitals half a world away. He'd saved lives in Afghanistan, had steady hands and a clear head under pressure, but here in this abandoned hospital, watching his only companion struggle, he felt helpless in a way that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, kneeling beside Ranger and running gentle fingers through the dog's coarse fur. "We'll figure this out." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew the cruel mathematics of their situation. Veterinary care cost money he didn't have. The county animal shelter would take Ranger, but only if Marcus surrendered him permanently. And there was no guarantee they wouldn't euthanize a scarred fighting dog with breathing problems. The thought of losing Ranger felt like contemplating the amputation of his own heart. As morning light revealed more details of their surroundings, Marcus noticed things he'd missed in the darkness. The break room's cabinets had been hastily emptied, but not thoroughly cleaned. In the back of one drawer, he found a hospital ID badge for Dr. Sarah Chen, psychiatric resident, as well as what looked like personal notes written on prescription pad paper. The handwriting was small, urgent. "Patient dosages don't match records. Asked Dr. H about discrepancies. She said, some things are above our clearance level. What does that even mean?"
Marcus pocketed the notes, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because Dr. Chen reminded him of Lieutenant Torres, a young medic who'd asked too many questions about casualty reports that didn't add up, only to be transferred to a different unit before she could dig deeper. The military had taught Marcus that when people started talking about clearance levels and need-to-know information, it usually meant someone was working very hard to hide something very bad. The sound of vehicles outside drew Marcus to the window. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows had pulled into the hospital's cracked parking lot. Men in expensive suits climbed out, their movements efficient and purposeful. Even from 4 stories up, Marcus could see the telltale bulge of concealed weapons beneath their jackets. These weren't city inspectors or urban explorers. These were people who got paid to make problems disappear. "Shit," Marcus breathed, grabbing his backpack and whistling softly to Ranger. "We need to move, boy. Now." But Ranger struggled to stand, his hind legs shaking with the effort. The dog tried to follow, loyalty overriding physical limitations, but collapsed after just a few steps. Marcus scooped him up, all 60 pounds of scarred muscle and unconditional devotion, and carried him toward the stairwell. Each step sent fire through Marcus's damaged knee, but he'd carried wounded soldiers through worse terrain under hostile fire. This was just another extraction, another life to save. The men in suits had entered the building. Marcus could hear their voices echoing up through the stairwell, professional, calm, discussing something about sweep patterns and containment protocols.
the language of people who cleaned up messes for a living, who made inconvenient problems cease to exist. Marcus climbed instead of descending, carrying Ranger toward the hospital's upper floors. It went against every instinct. Never trap yourself on higher ground when you could escape to street level. But something told him these men knew exactly what they were looking for, and it wasn't a homeless veteran and his sick dog. They were here for something specific, something connected to the Meridian Project and Dr. Hawthorne's nervous warning about files that shouldn't be discussed. The 5th floor housed the hospital's administrative offices, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms that had been stripped of most equipment but still retained the institutional feeling of bureaucratic power. Marcus found an office with a view of the parking lot and gently set Ranger down on a dusty couch. The dog's breathing had grown more labored during the climb, and Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, not at Ranger, but at the cosmic unfairness that seemed to follow him like a persistent shadow. "Why does everything I care about have to suffer?" he whispered to the empty room, the words spoken more to himself than to Ranger. It was a question that had haunted him since Afghanistan, since he'd watched good people die while corrupt officials profited from their sacrifice. His ex-girlfriend Sarah had asked him the same question during their final fight. "Why do you always have to carry the weight of the world? Why can't you just let some things go?" But Marcus had never learned how to let go. In Afghanistan, he'd been the medic who stayed late to check on recovering patients, who'd memorized the names of every soldier who died on his watch, who'd written letters to families explaining how their sons and daughters had been brave in their final moments. After his discharge, he'd tried to channel that same protective instinct into civilian life, but the systems he'd encountered, Veterans Affairs, social services, and mental health care, seemed designed more to manage problems than solve them. He'd lost his VA job after questioning experimental treatments. When Marcus had raised concerns about the potential legal and ethical violations, his supervisor had pulled him into a meeting with 2 men who identified themselves as consultants from Washington. They told him to stop asking questions. "These patients are receiving cutting-edge treatment that could revolutionize trauma therapy. Your job is to help them access services, not to second-guess medical decisions made by people with higher clearances than yours." Marcus had quit that afternoon, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. Word traveled fast in the veteran services community, and suddenly nobody wanted to hire a troublemaker who couldn't follow the chain of command. The eviction notice had arrived 3 months later, followed by Sarah's decision that she couldn't handle the stress of loving someone who was always fighting battles he couldn't win. Now, watching the men in suits systematically search the hospital floors below, Marcus wondered if he was about to repeat the same pattern, stumbling into something bigger than himself, asking questions that important people preferred not to answer. The smart play would be to wait until they left, then slip away with Ranger and pretend he'd never seen Dr. Chin's notes or Dr. Hawthorne's warning about the Meridian Project files. But as he watched the search team work, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the men was carrying a tablet computer, and every few minutes he would stop to check it against his surroundings, as if he was following some kind of digital map. When the man reached the 4th floor, the psychiatric unit where Marcus and Ranger had spent the night, he spent considerably more time in the break room, even taking photographs of the bulletin board where Dr. Hawthorne's warning still hung like a confession. They weren't just searching randomly. They were looking for something specific, and they knew exactly where to look, which meant someone had been watching the hospital, monitoring it for activity, waiting for what? For someone to discover the wrong thing? For the right person to ask the wrong questions? Marcus thought about Dr. Sarah Chen's ID badge still tucked in his jacket pocket. A psychiatric resident who'd noticed dosage discrepancies, who'd been told that some things were above her clearance level. Had she kept digging? Had she found whatever these men were now trying to locate? And if so, what had happened to her after the hospital closed? Ranger's coughing fit brought Marcus's attention back to the immediate crisis. The dog was struggling more now, his breathing shallow and rapid. Marcus had seen enough respiratory distress to know that Ranger needed medical attention soon, regardless of the cost or consequences. But getting him to a veterinary clinic would mean leaving the hospital, would mean exposing themselves to whatever surveillance network had brought these men here in the first place. Unless there was another option. Marcus remembered passing signs for the hospital's veterinary research facility during his exploration the night before. Most teaching hospitals had animal labs for medical research, and even after closure, some of the equipment might still be functional. It was a long shot, but Marcus had been living on long shots for months now. At worst, he might find some medical supplies that could help stabilize Ranger until they could reach proper care. The veterinary facility was located in the hospital's basement, accessible through a service elevator that had been secured with the same industrial tape that sealed the main elevators. But tape could be cut, and Marcus still carried the utility knife that had been standard issue in his field medic kit. The elevator car smelled like disinfectant and decades of institutional cooking, but it responded to button commands with surprising reliability. The basement felt different from the rest of the hospital. Less abandoned, more actively preserved. The corridors were cleaner, the lighting more consistent, and several doors required keycards to access. But Marcus had learned patience during his years of military service, and he systematically checked every unlocked room until he found what he was looking for. A veterinary examination room complete with monitoring equipment, oxygen supplies, and a locked cabinet that held various medications. Getting into the medication cabinet required skills Marcus had hoped never to use again. In Afghanistan, field medics sometimes had to liberate supplies from captured facilities when official channels moved too slowly to save lives. The lock was sophisticated, but not impenetrable, and Marcus's hands remembered the delicate work of persuading security mechanisms to cooperate. Among the stored medications, he found what he needed: bronchodilators that could help with Ranger's breathing, anti-inflammatory drugs that might reduce whatever was causing the respiratory distress, and even some antibiotics in case infection was involved. The dosages would have to be calculated based on Ranger's estimated weight and Marcus's fading memories of veterinary protocols from his combat medic training. As he prepared the first injection, Marcus found himself talking to Ranger in the same calm voice he'd once used with wounded soldiers. "This is gonna help, boy, I promise. Just like the docs helped me when I couldn't breathe right after the blast. Sometimes we all need a little chemical assistance to remember how to fight." The bronchodilator worked quickly. Within minutes, Ranger's breathing became less labored, his color improving as oxygen flow increased. But Marcus knew this was only a temporary solution. Whatever was wrong with Ranger, whether it was pneumonia, heart problems, or something else entirely, would require more comprehensive treatment that Marcus could provide with stolen medications in an abandoned hospital basement. Still, watching his companion breathe more easily felt like a small victory in a life that had been short on victories lately. Marcus settled onto the examination room floor beside Ranger, both of them breathing more easily now, both of them surviving another crisis through a combination of stubbornness, medical knowledge, and the kind of luck that couldn't be counted on indefinitely. But as he sat there in the artificial quiet of the veterinary facility, Marcus began to notice details that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple animal research lab. The examination rooms were equipped with video monitoring systems that seemed far more sophisticated than necessary for routine veterinary procedures. Several of the locked cabinets bore labels for medications that Marcus recognized as psychiatric drugs, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, experimental compounds that had no business being stored in a veterinary facility. And on one of the computer workstations that had been left running on backup power, Marcus found a login screen for something called Meridian Patient Database. The same Meridian project that Dr. Hawthorne had been worried about, apparently connected to both psychiatric patients and veterinary research in ways that Marcus's trained medic instincts screamed warnings. He was looking at evidence of something much larger than financial irregularities or simple administrative corruption. This was the kind of systematic cover-up that required resources, coordination, and the kind of institutional power that could make entire hospitals disappear from public memory. The men upstairs weren't just searching for missing files. They were trying to ensure that whatever the Meridian Project had been, it stayed buried, along with anyone who might have questions about it. Marcus thought again about Dr. Sarah Chen, about her notes questioning patient dosages and her supervisor's cryptic response about clearance levels. Had she stumbled onto the same evidence that Marcus was now staring at? Had her questions about psychiatric medication led her down the same rabbit hole that apparently swallowed an entire hospital's worth of secrets? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside jolted Marcus back to the present danger. The search team had found the basement level, and they were moving systematically through the facilities just as they had on the upper floors. Marcus quickly gathered the medications he'd used to treat Ranger, erased his fingerprints from the computer workstation, and helped his still-recovering companion to his feet. But as they prepared to leave the veterinary facility, Marcus made a decision that he knew Sarah would have called another example of his inability to let sleeping dogs lie. He photographed the Meridian patient database login screen with his phone, documenting evidence of whatever connection existed between psychiatric patients and veterinary research. If Dr. Chen had died for asking the wrong questions, then someone needed to ensure her questions didn't die with her. The elevator ride back to the main floor felt like ascending from one kind of hell into another. Above, the search team continued their systematic sweep. Below, the evidence of systematic human experimentation waited to be discovered by whoever had the courage and resources to dig deep enough. And caught between them, Marcus and Ranger represented the kind of inconvenient witnesses that powerful people had been making disappear for as long as power and people had coexisted. But Marcus had learned something important during his years as a combat medic. Sometimes the most important victories happen not when you saved a life, but when you refuse to let death claim someone without a fight. Dr. Chen might be beyond saving, but her questions deserved answers. The patients who'd been subjected to whatever the Meridian Project represented deserved justice. And somewhere in this maze of institutional secrets and bureaucratic cover-ups, there had to be someone with the authority and courage to ensure that truth eventually surfaced. As Marcus and Ranger prepared to navigate their way out of St. Margaret's Hospital, both of them breathing easier but neither of them truly safe, Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Once again, he'd stumbled into a situation where walking away might be the smart choice, but staying to fight might be the right one. And despite everything, despite the homelessness, the poverty, the systematic abandonment by the institutions he'd served, Marcus still believed that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing. The question was whether he and Ranger would live long enough to prove it. The service tunnel beneath St. Margaret's Hospital stretched into darkness like the throat of some massive beast, its concrete walls weeping decades of accumulated moisture. Marcus carried Ranger through the narrow passage, following maintenance signs that promised an exit near the hospital's old power plant. The bronchodilator had helped, but Ranger was still weak, and Marcus could feel his own strength ebbing with each step. They'd been underground for nearly an hour, navigating by the pale glow of Marcus's dying phone flashlight, when they heard the first explosion. The blast shook dust from the tunnel ceiling and sent a shockwave through the concrete floor that Marcus felt in his bones. Emergency lighting flickered to life, casting everything in a hellish red glow that reminded him too vividly of nights in Kandahar when the mortars fell like deadly rain. Ranger whimpered and pressed closer to Marcus's legs, sensing danger in ways that transcended species boundaries. "They're not just searching anymore," Marcus whispered, his combat instincts translating the sound with grim precision. "They're destroying evidence." Above them, through layers of concrete and steel, St. Margaret's Hospital was being systematically erased, not abandoned, not condemned, eliminated. Whatever secrets the Meridian Project had generated were important enough that someone with serious resources was willing to level an entire building to keep them buried. The kind of people who could orchestrate hospital closures, manipulate financial records, and make problematic doctors disappear were now taking the final step in their cover-up protocol. Marcus had seen this before in Afghanistan, when his unit had stumbled across a medical facility that was supposedly treating local civilians but was actually conducting experiments on prisoners of war. The official story was that insurgents had bombed the building. The reality was that someone in the Pentagon had decided that certain kinds of medical research were too sensitive to survive congressional oversight. 3 days after Marcus's unit filed their report, the facility had been reduced to rubble, and their commanding officer had received orders transferring the entire unit to different theaters of operation. The tunnel system was more extensive than Marcus had realized. What he'd initially taken for simple maintenance access revealed itself to be a network of interconnected passages that honeyed the ground beneath not just the hospital, but the entire downtown area of Millbrook. Some of the passages looked old, Depression-era construction with that distinctive stonework that spoke of government work programs and civic pride. Others were clearly more recent, with modern electrical systems and climate control that suggested regular use well into the hospital's operational period. It was in one of these newer sections that Marcus found the first body. Dr. Sarah Chen had been dead for approximately 18 months based on the state of decomposition and the hospital ID badge that still hung around her neck. She was seated at what had once been a computer workstation, her skeletal hands still positioned over a keyboard as if death had interrupted her in the middle of typing. The computer monitor was dark, but when Marcus pressed the power button, it flickered to life with the slow reluctance of hardware that had been running on backup power for far too long. The screen displayed a document titled Meridian Project, Final Report, Dr. S. Chen. The text was dense with medical terminology, but Marcus's training allowed him to parse the essential horror of what he was reading. The Meridian Project hadn't been treating psychiatric patients. It had been creating them. Deliberate trauma induction, experimental drug protocols, systematic psychological conditioning designed to produce specific behavioral outcomes in test subjects who had been recruited from among the most vulnerable populations. Homeless veterans, undocumented immigrants, patients with no family connections or social support systems. Marcus felt his stomach turn as he read Chen's documentation of the project's methodology. The veterinary facility hadn't been for animal research. It had been for monitoring and maintaining human subjects who were being treated, literally, like laboratory animals. The psychiatric medications Marcus had found weren't for treating mental illness, they were for inducing it, for creating controllable psychological states that could be studied and refined. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed, scrolling through page after page of clinical observations that read like a roadmap to manufactured madness. They were turning people into weapons. Because that's what the Meridian Project had actually been about, not treatment, but weaponization. Creating individuals whose psychological conditioning would make them ideal candidates for certain kinds of operations. Assassins who wouldn't remember their missions. Suicide bombers who would believe they were acting on divine inspiration. Corporate whistleblowers who would destroy their own credibility before they could expose inconvenient truths. Dr. Chen had documented everything with the methodical precision of a researcher who knew she was creating evidence for a tribunal that might never convene. Patient files, drug protocols, video recordings of conditioning sessions, financial records showing payments from a network of shell companies that traced back to defense contractors and intelligence agencies. She'd been building a case for the kind of war crimes prosecution that could topple governments and reshape international law. And they'd killed her for it. But as Marcus began following her instructions, copying files to a series of encrypted drives that Chen had hidden throughout the facility, he realized that the explosions above weren't random destruction. They were following a pattern, systematically working through the hospital structure in a way that would eventually reach the basement levels. Someone knew about this data archive, and they were making sure it would be destroyed along with everything else. Marcus worked faster, his fingers flying over the keyboard with muscle memory from his military intelligence training. In Afghanistan, he'd sometimes been tasked with securing sensitive data from captured facilities before demolition teams arrived to sanitize the sites. The protocols were always the same: copy everything, verify the copies, then run like hell before the buildings came down. But this time was different. This time, the data he was copying implicated his own government in systematic violations of every international treaty governing human rights and medical ethics. This time, running meant abandoning evidence that could prevent similar projects from being conducted in other locations, with other victims who might not be as fortunate as the patients who at least died quickly when the hospital closed. Ranger had recovered enough strength to explore their surroundings, and his enhanced senses detected something that Marcus's human perception had missed. The dog began pawing at what looked like a solid wall, whining in the specific way that indicated he'd found something important. When Marcus investigated, he discovered that the wall was actually a concealed door, opened by a keypad that Dr. Chen's notes indicated would respond to her hospital ID number. Beyond the door lay something that defied Marcus's understanding of what was possible, even in a world where hospitals conducted illegal human experiments. The chamber was huge, easily the size of a football field, and filled with what could only be described as living quarters: dormitory-style beds, communal bathrooms, a cafeteria area, and recreational facilities that looked like they'd been designed to house several hundred people for extended periods of time. But the most disturbing feature of the facility was the observation deck that overlooked the living area like a corporate boardroom designed for watching gladiatorial combat. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided perfect sightlines to every corner of the underground complex, while recording equipment and monitoring stations suggested that every moment of the residents' lives had been documented and analyzed. Marcus found resident logs that painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation spanning nearly a decade. Individuals had been brought to the facility under various pretexts: drug rehabilitation, psychiatric treatment, job training programs. But once inside, they'd become subjects in an elaborate experiment designed to determine the most effective methods for controlling human behavior. Sleep deprivation, dietary manipulation, pharmaceutical conditioning, social isolation, and controlled exposure to violence and trauma had all been employed to reshape personality and break down individual resistance to external control. The final phase of the Meridian Project had involved field testing, releasing subjects back into the general population with specific programming designed to activate under certain conditions. Some had been conditioned to respond to particular phrases or images by committing acts of violence. Others had been programmed to spread misinformation or engage in behaviors designed to discredit political movements or activist organizations. Still others had been turned into unwitting intelligence assets, gathering information from their communities and reporting back through channels they didn't consciously understand. They turned them into sleeper agents, Marcus realized, reading through case files that documented the systematic destruction of human consciousness and free will, living weapons that didn't even know they were weapons. The final piece of the puzzle was a communication log that showed regular contact between the Meridian Project facility and a network of similar installations across the country. Weekly reports, resource sharing, personnel transfers, and coordination of research protocols suggested a systematic program operating at a scale that dwarfed anything Marcus had imagined possible. And at the center of it all, a network of individuals who had convinced themselves that their work served some greater good, that violating the most fundamental principles of medical ethics and human dignity was justified by national security concerns that superseded individual rights.
Marcus thought about his own experiences with the VA system, about experimental medications prescribed without proper consent protocols, about patients whose behavior had changed in ways that hadn't made sense at the time. How many other veterans had been subjected to preliminary versions of Meridian Project conditioning? How many homeless shelters, addiction treatment centers, and psychiatric facilities were actually fronts for research programs designed to create controllable human assets. The explosions above were getting closer, and Marcus could hear the sound of structural supports failing as the hospital's demolition continued. But he couldn't leave without ensuring that Dr. Chen's evidence would survive, that someone with the authority and resources to act on it would eventually discover the truth about what had happened here. That's when Ranger made his most important discovery. The dog had been exploring a section of the facility that Marcus hadn't yet investigated, following scent trails that told stories of recent human presence. When Marcus found him, Ranger was pawing at a locked door that bore no identification labels or warning signs. But the electronic lock was sophisticated, and the reinforced construction suggested that whatever lay beyond was considered especially sensitive. Dr. Chen's access codes worked on this door as well, revealing a chamber that contained the Meridian Project's crown jewel, a complete psychological conditioning facility designed to reprogram human consciousness with surgical precision. The equipment looked like something from a science fiction film: immersive virtual reality systems, neurological monitoring devices, pharmaceutical delivery systems that could administer precise dosages of consciousness-altering drugs directly into specific brain regions. But it wasn't the technology that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was the scheduling system that showed the facility had been operational until just weeks before the hospital's official closure. And according to the patient logs, some of the most recent subjects had been military veterans seeking treatment for PTSD through programs that had been advertised as cutting-edge therapeutic interventions. Marcus recognized some of the names on the patient list: veterans who had later committed suicide, engaged in domestic violence, or simply disappeared from their communities without explanation. Men and women who had sought help for psychological wounds sustained in service to their country, only to become subjects in experiments that had turned their trauma into weapons against themselves and others. The final piece of the puzzle was a communication log that showed regular contact between the Meridian Project facility and a network of similar installations across the country. Weekly reports, resource sharing, personnel transfers, and coordination of research protocols that suggested a systematic program operating at a scale that dwarfed anything Marcus had imagined possible. This wasn't a rogue medical experiment or a single corrupt institution. This was an organized program with nationwide reach, government funding, and corporate partnerships that had been operating in plain sight while maintaining perfect operational security. The kind of conspiracy that required institutional capture at multiple levels of government, medicine, and private industry. Marcus was copying the last of the critical files when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing everything in that familiar red glow, but the message was clear. The demolition had reached the building's main electrical systems. They had minutes, maybe less, before the basement levels would be sealed forever beneath tons of rubble. But as Marcus prepared to flee with the evidence that could expose one of the most extensive violations of human rights in American history, he realized that someone else was in the facility with them. Footsteps echoed through the corridors, not the heavy boots of demolition workers, but the measured pace of individuals who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find when they got there.
The same voices Marcus had heard earlier in the hospital, now moving through the underground complex with the confidence of people who had been here before. They weren't surprised by the facility's existence. They were conducting a final sweep to ensure that nothing incriminating survived the building's destruction. Marcus grabbed the encrypted drives containing Dr. Chen's research, scooped up Ranger, and began moving through the facility's maze of corridors towards what he hoped was an exit that the cleanup team hadn't anticipated. Behind them, he could hear systematic destruction, computers being smashed, files being burned, evidence being erased with the methodical efficiency of people who had performed similar operations many times before. But Dr. Chen had been thorough in her preparation for this moment. Hidden throughout the facility, Marcus found backup drives, printed documents sealed in waterproof containers, and even handwritten notes that documented the most critical aspects of the Meridian Project's operations. She'd created a redundant information system designed to survive exactly the kind of sanitization operation that was now underway. The facility's emergency exit opened into a storm drainage system that connected to the city's water management infrastructure. As Marcus and Ranger splashed through knee-deep water towards what he hoped was freedom, the hospital above them completed its transformation from architectural monument to archaeological crater. The sound of the final collapse echoed through the drainage tunnels like the death cry of some massive creature, and Marcus knew that the physical evidence of the Meridian Project had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. But the documentary evidence survived, sealed in waterproof containers and encrypted storage devices that contained enough information to expose the individuals and institutions responsible for a decade of illegal human experimentation. Dr. Sarah Chen had died creating a weapon more dangerous than anything the Meridian Project had produced: the truth, preserved in forms that could survive both physical destruction and systematic cover-up attempts. As Marcus emerged from the storm drainage system into the gray dawn light of Millbrook's industrial district, carrying Ranger and the evidence that could topple governments, he realized that his life had just changed in ways that made his previous homelessness seem like a minor inconvenience. He was now in possession of information that powerful people had killed to protect, and they would certainly kill again to prevent its disclosure. But Marcus had spent years as a combat medic, watching young soldiers die for principles they believed in. He'd learned that some things were worth dying for, and preventing future victims of programs like Meridian was definitely one of them. The question wasn't whether he would fight. The question was whether he would live long enough to ensure that Dr. Chen's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed as emergency responders rushed toward the hospital disaster that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. The official story would blame structural failure, environmental factors, anything except the deliberate demolition that Marcus had witnessed. But the truth would survive in the evidence he now carried, waiting for the right moment and the right platform to emerge into public consciousness. St. Margaret's Hospital was gone, but the secrets it had harbored would live on in the encrypted files that documented one of the most extensive violations of human rights in modern American history. And somewhere in Millbrook, the people responsible for the Meridian Project were already planning their next operation, confident that they had successfully eliminated the last traces of their previous crimes. They were wrong. The abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Millbrook had been closed for 15 years, its windows boarded over and its parking lot surrendered to weeds and weather. But the building's bones were solid, and more importantly, it sat in a cellular dead zone where Marcus's phone couldn't be tracked by the sophisticated surveillance systems he was now certain were hunting him. He'd carried Ranger 3 miles through back roads and drainage ditches, moving with the careful paranoia of someone who understood that his survival depended on staying invisible until he could figure out who to trust with information that could destroy careers, topple institutions, and potentially save lives.
Ranger's condition had stabilized since the bronchodilator treatment, but the dog remained weak, conserving energy with the wisdom of a creature that had learned to survive on the margins of human society. Marcus had fashioned a comfortable nest for him in what had once been the station's customer waiting area, using old tarps and his own jacket to create insulation against the October cold that seeped through broken windows like the breath of approaching winter. The encrypted drives containing Dr. Chen's research sat before Marcus like digital time bombs, their contents representing either salvation or a death sentence depending on how carefully he managed their revelation. He'd found an old laptop computer in the gas station's office, probably left behind by the last owner and forgotten in the chaos of business closure, and miraculously, it still functioned after being connected to a car battery Marcus had salvaged from the service bay. Dr. Chen's files were organized with the methodical precision of a researcher who knew she was documenting crimes for posterity. Patient records, financial transactions, correspondence between project directors and their government handlers, video recordings of conditioning sessions that made Marcus's combat-hardened stomach turn with disgust and rage.
The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and absolutely certain to result in Marcus's death if he approached the wrong people with it. The challenge was identifying anyone in positions of authority who wasn't already compromised by the Meridian Project's extensive network of institutional capture. The patient files included names Marcus recognized from newspaper headlines: a congressman who had committed suicide after being caught in a financial scandal, an environmental activist who had been discredited by increasingly erratic behavior, a corporate whistleblower whose testimony had been dismissed after she'd been found wandering downtown naked and talking to imaginary conspirators. All of them had been Meridian Project subjects. All of them had been programmed to destroy their own credibility when they became inconvenient to powerful interests. The implications were staggering. How many political careers, activist movements, and corporate accountability efforts had been derailed by victims who didn't even realize they were being controlled by psychological conditioning that had been implanted years earlier? Marcus found correspondence between project directors that revealed the true scope of their ambitions. The Meridian Project wasn't just about creating individual assets. It was about perfecting techniques for mass population control. The experimental protocols being tested on vulnerable individuals in hospital basements were designed to be scaled up for use against entire communities through water supplies, pharmaceutical distribution networks, and even social media platforms that could deliver precisely targeted psychological manipulations. "They're not just destroying people," Marcus said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty gas station as Ranger lifted his head to listen. "They're perfecting the destruction so they can do it to everyone." But as Marcus studied the files more carefully, he began to see cracks in the conspiracy's armor. Dr. Chen hadn't been the only researcher with ethical concerns about the project's direction. Several other doctors and technicians had raised questions about patient consent, legal liability, and long-term psychological effects. Some had been transferred to different assignments. Others had been terminated for performance issues that seemed suspiciously timed to coincide with their expressions of concern. And one, Dr. Michael Reeves, a neurologist who had helped design the psychological conditioning protocols, had apparently survived his departure from the project and was currently working at a research hospital in Boston. According to Dr. Chen's notes, Reeves had maintained copies of critical research data as an insurance policy against potential criminal prosecution, and he'd been attempting to develop treatment protocols that could reverse some of the conditioning's effects. Dr. Reeves represented Marcus's best hope for finding someone with both the expertise to understand the Meridian Project's implications and the resources to help expose it safely. But reaching him would require careful planning and extraordinary security measures. The conspiracy that had operated St. Margaret's Hospital had demonstrated its willingness to eliminate inconvenient witnesses, and they'd certainly be monitoring anyone connected to their former research programs. Marcus spent hours studying maps of Boston, planning routes that would minimize his exposure to traffic cameras, facial recognition systems, and the kind of surveillance infrastructure that had become ubiquitous in major American cities. He'd learned operational security techniques during his military service, but evading a domestic intelligence operation required different skills and resources than avoiding enemy combatants in Afghanistan. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that Dr. Chen had maintained contact with a network of journalists, activists, and legal professionals who specialized in exposing government misconduct. She'd been building a coalition of people who could help her disseminate her evidence if she didn't survive to do it herself. Insurance policies designed to ensure that her death wouldn't silence her documentation of systematic human rights violations. Among the contacts, Marcus found someone who might be able to help. Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist who had spent years documenting CIA torture programs, military contractor fraud, and government surveillance overreach. According to Dr. Chen's notes, Martinez had been working on a story about mysterious patient disappearances from VA hospitals when the Meridian Project's institutional connections had blocked her access to official sources. Martinez lived in Washington, D.C., which was simultaneously the best and worst possible location for Marcus's purposes. Best because it was the center of American journalism and government oversight, where the right story could generate enough attention to provide protective publicity. Worst because it was also the center of American intelligence operations, where the wrong move could result in Marcus being disappeared into the same black sites that had swallowed other inconvenient witnesses. But Marcus had learned during his years as a combat medic that sometimes the only way forward was through the most dangerous territory. Dr. Chen had died trying to expose the truth about Meridian. The least he could do was ensure her sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. The journey from Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C. took 2 days of careful travel, moving in short stages through small towns and avoiding major highways where license plate readers could track their progress. Marcus had traded his Honda Civic to a mechanic in exchange for an older pickup truck that couldn't be traced to his identity. And he'd paid cash for everything: gas, food, camping supplies, to avoid creating digital footprints that sophisticated surveillance systems could follow. Ranger had recovered enough strength to enjoy car travel, his head hanging out the passenger window with the enthusiasm of a dog who had remembered what it felt like to have adventures instead of just surviving from one crisis to the next. The bronchodilators Marcus had found at the hospital were working, but he knew they were only buying time. Ranger needed proper veterinary care, and soon. But first, Marcus needed to ensure that the evidence of Meridian Project crimes reached someone who could act on it. Washington, D.C. in October was a city dressed in autumn's royal colors, the trees along the Potomac painted in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Marcus why he'd once loved this country enough to risk his life defending it. But beneath the postcard beauty lay the machinery of power that had enabled systematic human rights violations to continue for years without accountability or oversight. Marcus found Rebecca Martinez at a coffee shop near the DuPont Circle metro station, exactly where Dr. Chen's notes had indicated she conducted meetings with sources who needed to remain anonymous. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably early 30s, but her eyes held the kind of focused intensity that he associated with people who had seen enough institutional corruption to understand how deeply the system's failures ran.
Dr. Chen told me someone might contact me eventually, Martinez said after Marcus had introduced himself using the authentication code Chen had provided. She said it would be someone who had stumbled into something bigger than they'd expected. Someone who needed help exposing information that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Marcus slid one of the encrypted drives across the coffee shop table, along with Dr. Chen's handwritten instructions for accessing its contents. It's worse than she thought when she wrote those notes. The Meridian Project wasn't just experimenting on psychiatric patients. They were turning people into weapons, programming them to destroy themselves and others when they became inconvenient to certain interests. Martinez connected the drive to a laptop computer that looked like it had been modified with additional security hardware. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed Dr. Chen's documentation, occasionally stopping to cross-reference names against her own research files. After nearly an hour of careful examination, she looked up at Marcus with the expression of someone who had just realized that her worst suspicions about government misconduct had been wildly optimistic. "This is bigger than anything I've worked on before," she said quietly, conscious that even in a crowded coffee shop, certain conversations required careful discretion. The patient files alone represent systematic violations of every international treaty governing human experimentation. The financial records show government funding for research that would be considered crimes against humanity in any legitimate court system. And the scope: hundreds of victims over nearly a decade, with connections to similar facilities nationwide. But Martinez's expertise extended beyond just documenting government crimes. She understood the practical challenges of exposing conspiracies that involved high-level officials, corporate executives,
and intelligence agencies with unlimited resources for discrediting inconvenient witnesses. Publishing Dr. Chen's evidence would require careful coordination with legal experts, medical professionals, and political allies who could provide protective oversight during the inevitable backlash. The people who operated Meridian have already demonstrated their willingness to kill researchers who asked inconvenient questions. They demolished an entire hospital to destroy physical evidence, and they've been systematically eliminating anyone who might testify about what they witnessed. Exposing them will require more than just documentation. It will require building a coalition large enough that they can't silence all of us simultaneously. Over the following days, Marcus found himself drawn into a network of individuals who had been investigating different aspects of the same systematic corruption that had produced the Meridian Project. Civil rights attorneys documenting suspicious patient disappearances from government medical facilities. Congressional staff members who had noticed unusual budget allocations for classified research programs. Medical professionals who had questioned experimental treatment protocols that seemed designed more for data collection than patient care. Each person in the network had been working on pieces of a puzzle that none of them had been able to solve individually. Marcus's evidence from St. Margaret's Hospital provided the missing connections that revealed the full scope of a conspiracy that extended far beyond a single medical facility in Pennsylvania. Dr. Michael Reeves, the neurologist who had helped design Meridian's psychological conditioning protocols, agreed to meet with Marcus and Martinez at his research hospital in Boston. The conversation took place in a secure conference room that Reeves had swept for surveillance devices, surrounded by medical equipment that could mask their voices from any electronic monitoring systems that might be attempting to record their discussion. "I've been trying to develop reversal protocols for 3 years," Reeves explained, his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed Dr. Chen's documentation of his former colleagues' crimes. Most of the psychological conditioning can be undone with proper therapeutic intervention, but it requires knowing exactly what techniques were used on each individual patient. Without access to the original programming records, I've been working blind, trying to reverse engineer treatments based on behavioral symptoms alone. But Dr. Chen's files contained precisely the programming records that Reeves needed to help Meridian Project victims recover their psychological autonomy. Patient identification numbers, specific conditioning protocols, pharmaceutical interventions, even session recordings that documented exactly how each individual's consciousness had been systematically restructured to serve external interests. "We can help them," Reeves said, his voice carrying the first hope Marcus had heard from anyone connected to the Meridian Project investigation. Not all of them. Some of the conditioning was too extensive, too integrated into their core personality structures, but many of them can be helped to reclaim their own minds, to understand how they've been manipulated, and to develop resistance to future programming attempts. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was ambitious, but necessary. Martinez would publish a series of articles exposing the Meridian Project's operations, but she would coordinate the publication with legal challenges filed by civil rights attorneys, congressional hearings demanded by oversight committees, and therapeutic interventions provided by Dr. Reeves and his colleagues. The goal wasn't just to expose past crimes, but to prevent future ones by creating enough public awareness and institutional accountability to make similar projects impossible to operate in secrecy. It was the kind of coordinated response that had been needed years earlier, when Dr. Chen had first tried to raise concerns about patient dosage discrepancies and had been told that some things were above her clearance level. But as the coalition prepared to go public with their evidence, Marcus received a phone call that reminded him just how dangerous their situation had become. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and absolutely certain that Marcus would comply with the instructions he was about to receive. "Mr. Vale, you're in possession of materials that belong to the United States government. We're prepared to offer you a very generous settlement in exchange for their return, along with your agreement to sign certain non-disclosure agreements that would protect national security interests while ensuring your financial security for the rest of your life." Marcus recognized the tone from his encounters with Pentagon officials who had tried to silence his unit's reports about the illegal medical facility in Afghanistan. The same smooth confidence, the same assumption that everyone had a price, the same underlying threat disguised as a reasonable business proposition. "And if I'm not interested in your generous settlement?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll discover that homelessness can be a very dangerous lifestyle, Mr. Vale. Accidents happen. Veterans with PTSD sometimes make poor decisions that result in tragic consequences. Dogs get sick and die from mysterious illnesses that veterinarians can't diagnose or treat effectively." The threat against Ranger hit Marcus harder than any danger to himself. Throughout everything, the homelessness, the poverty, the systematic abandonment by institutions he'd served, Ranger had been the one constant source of loyalty and companionship in his life. The idea that these people would poison his dog to maintain their conspiracy secrecy filled Marcus with the kind of rage that once made him an effective combat medic and would now make him a formidable enemy. "I'll think about your offer," Marcus said, ending the call and immediately beginning preparations to ensure that Dr. Chen's evidence would survive regardless of what happened to him or Ranger. The time for careful planning and gradual coalition building had ended. The Meridian Project's handlers had revealed their awareness of the investigation and their willingness to escalate to lethal force to protect their secrets. Marcus, Martinez, Dr. Reeves, and their collaborators now had a choice: abandon their efforts to expose systematic human rights violations, or accept the risks that came with challenging institutions that had been operating above the law for years. For Marcus, who had spent his adult life trying to heal people who had been broken by systems beyond their control, the choice was obvious. Dr. Chen died rather than allow her evidence to be buried with her questions. The hundreds of Meridian Project victims deserved justice, even if seeking it required accepting extraordinary personal risk.
But is Marcus prepared for the final phase of their investigation, the coordinated public revelation that would either expose one of the most extensive government conspiracies in American history or result in the elimination of everyone involved in bringing it to light? He realized that he was no longer the homeless veteran who had sought shelter in an abandoned hospital just days earlier. He was now the custodian of evidence that could change how Americans understood their own government's capacity for systematic evil. The question was whether he would live long enough to ensure that Dr. Chen's sacrifice achieved the justice she had died trying to secure. Outside the secure conference room where the final plans were being made, autumn continued its inexorable transformation of Washington, D.C.'s landscape, painting the trees in colors that would soon give way to winter's stark honesty. But inside that room, surrounded by people who had chosen truth over safety and justice over survival, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his discharge from military service: the sense that his life had purpose beyond mere survival, that his actions might prevent other people from experiencing the kind of systematic abandonment and betrayal that had defined his own journey from decorated veteran to homeless witness. The revelation was coming, and with it, the recognition that some fights were worth the ultimate sacrifice. The Washington Post newsroom buzzed with the electric tension that preceded the kind of story that would reshape public understanding of government accountability. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when Rebecca Martinez's exposé went live on the newspaper's website, simultaneously with coordinated releases by the New York Times, The Guardian, and 67 other news organizations across the globe. The headline was stark, uncompromising. Secret government program turned veterans and vulnerable citizens into programmed weapons. Marcus Vale stood in the newsroom's security office, watching multiple television screens as cable news networks scrambled to process the magnitude of what they were reporting. Ranger lay beside him on a specially installed veterinary bed, his breathing steady and strong after receiving proper medical treatment from a veterinarian who specialized in trauma recovery.
The dog's amber eyes tracked the movement of journalists and editors who rushed past the security office windows, and Marcus could see in his companion's relaxed posture the same sense of relief he felt in his own chest. They had survived, against all odds, against systematic attempts to silence them, against the overwhelming power of institutions that had operated in secrecy for nearly a decade. They had survived to see justice begin its slow, imperfect work. The evidence Dr. Sarah Chen had died to preserve was now public knowledge, protected by the combined resources of international journalism and the legal immunity that came with worldwide attention. The encrypted drives Marcus had carried out of St. Margaret's Hospital contained documentation that was already being cited in emergency congressional hearings, UN Human Rights Commission investigations, and criminal prosecutions that would reshape American law enforcement for generations. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing since the story broke," Martinez said, entering the security office with the exhausted satisfaction of a journalist who had published the story of her career. Congressional oversight committees, international human rights organizations, law enforcement agencies from 12 different countries. Everyone wants access to the primary source documents, and everyone wants to talk to the man who carried them out of a demolished hospital. But Marcus found himself less interested in the media attention than in the lists that Dr. Reeves had compiled. Names and addresses of Meridian Project survivors who could now receive treatment to reverse their psychological conditioning. Over 400 individuals who had been programmed to destroy themselves or others when they became inconvenient to powerful interests, many of whom had spent years believing they were suffering from natural mental illness rather than systematic torture. The therapeutic protocols Dr. Reeves had developed were complex, requiring months of intensive treatment to safely dismantle the psychological structures that had been implanted in victims' minds. But the early results were encouraging. Patients were recovering memories of their time in Meridian facilities, understanding how their behavior had been controlled by external programming, and beginning the difficult process of reclaiming their authentic identities.
Mrs. Patricia Donnelly called this morning, Dr. Reeves reported during his daily briefing with Marcus and the legal team that had formed around the Meridian investigation. She's the environmental activist who was discredited 3 years ago after being found wandering downtown during what appeared to be a psychotic episode. She remembered everything: the conditioning sessions, the pharmaceutical protocols, even the specific trigger phrases that were designed to activate her programming when certain corporate interests needed her silenced. Each recovered memory added another piece to the puzzle of systematic human rights violations that had been operating under the cover of medical research and national security. The Meridian Project hadn't just been experimenting on vulnerable individuals. It had been perfecting techniques for controlling democratic processes, manipulating public discourse, and eliminating political opposition through psychological warfare that left no visible fingerprints. The scope of the conspiracy continued to expand as more evidence emerged. Congressional investigators had discovered connections between Meridian facilities and pharmaceutical companies that had been testing experimental drugs on unwilling subjects. Corporate accountability lawyers had traced financial networks that funneled money from defense contractors to research programs designed to weaponize human psychology. International human rights organizations had found similar programs operating in at least 14 countries, all coordinated through intelligence sharing agreements that had been hidden from legislative oversight. Marcus found himself testifying before congressional committees, UN investigators, and grand juries that were working to identify everyone who had participated or benefited from the Meridian Project's operations. The process was exhausting, requiring him to relive trauma while navigating legal systems that were still struggling to understand crimes that had no precedent in American jurisprudence. But the most meaningful moments came when Marcus met with Meridian Project survivors who were undergoing treatment to recover their psychological autonomy.
veterans who had been programmed to destroy their own military records before they could file disability claims, activists who had been conditioned to sabotage their own movements when their work threatened corporate interests, journalists who had been manipulated into publishing false information that discredited their own investigative findings.
But the documentary evidence Dr. Chen had preserved was overwhelming, and the public attention generated by coordinated media coverage made it politically impossible for government officials to invoke national security privileges to protect the conspirators. Within 6 months of the initial revelation, 43 individuals had been indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit torture to violations of international law governing human experimentation. The trials that followed would reshape American understanding of government accountability and corporate responsibility. Testimony from Meridian Project survivors provided unprecedented insights into techniques for manipulating human consciousness, while expert witnesses from the medical and legal communities explained how institutional structures had been corrupted to enable systematic abuse. Marcus found himself becoming an unwitting public figure, invited to speak at universities, medical conferences, and human rights organizations about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation by powerful institutions. The attention was uncomfortable for someone who had spent years trying to remain invisible, but he understood that his visibility provided protection for other potential whistleblowers who might discover evidence of similar programs. The Meridian Project wasn't an aberration, Marcus told a Senate Oversight Committee during one of his many testimonies. It was the logical conclusion of institutional cultures that prioritize secrecy over accountability, that treat vulnerable populations as acceptable casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. Until we address the systemic failures that made Meridian possible, we'll continue to see variations of the same crimes committed by different people in different institutions. The financial settlements that eventually emerged from civil lawsuits were substantial. Over $350 million distributed among Meridian Project survivors, their families, and the communities that had been affected by the program's operations. But Marcus knew that money could never fully compensate for the psychological damage that had been inflicted on hundreds of individuals who had been turned into weapons against themselves and their own communities. More important than financial compensation was the systematic reform of institutions that had enabled the Meridian Project to operate with impunity for nearly a decade. New oversight mechanisms for government-funded medical research, enhanced protections for research subjects, mandatory reporting requirements for experimental procedures, and international monitoring systems designed to detect and prevent similar programs in the future. The reforms were imperfect, compromised by political realities and institutional resistance from organizations that preferred to operate without external scrutiny. But they represented significant progress toward the kind of accountability that Dr. Chen had died trying to achieve. And they provided frameworks for future whistleblowers who might discover evidence of systematic human rights violations. Dr. Reeves established a treatment center specifically for survivors of psychological conditioning programs, funded by the legal settlements and supported by a network of medical professionals who had been horrified by the Meridian Project's revelations. The center provided not just therapeutic services, but also research into techniques for detecting and reversing various forms of involuntary mental programming. We're learning that the human mind is both vulnerable and resilient than we previously understood, Dr. Reeves explained during a medical conference where he presented findings from his work with Meridian survivors. The same neuroplasticity that made psychological conditioning possible also makes recovery possible, given proper therapeutic intervention and sufficient time for healing. The center became a beacon of hope for individuals who had suffered various forms of systematic psychological abuse, from cult survivors to victims of domestic violence who had been subjected to sophisticated forms of mental manipulation. The techniques developed for treating Meridian Project survivors proved applicable to a much broader range of trauma-related conditions,
advancing the field of psychiatric medicine in ways that benefited thousands of patients beyond the immediate victims of government experimentation. Marcus found his own healing through his work advocating for Meridian Project survivors and speaking publicly about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from institutional exploitation. The sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his discharge from military service was restored through his role as a guardian of Dr. Chen's legacy and a voice for people who had been systematically silenced by powerful interests. Ranger recovered fully from his respiratory problems, thriving in an environment where he received regular veterinary care and had consistent access to proper nutrition. The dog seemed to understand that their period of desperate survival had ended, settling into a routine that included daily walks through Washington, D.C.'s parks and regular visits to the treatment center where Meridian survivors came to reclaim their psychological autonomy. The bond between Marcus and Ranger deepened as they transitioned from survival partners to companions in a larger mission of healing and accountability. The dog's presence provided comfort to trauma survivors who were struggling to trust their own perceptions after years of systematic psychological manipulation. There was something profoundly therapeutic about connecting with a creature whose loyalty was uncomplicated by the kind of institutional politics that had enabled human rights violations to continue for years without accountability. 2 years after the initial revelation of the Meridian Project, Marcus received a letter that brought his journey full circle. It was from Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the former chief of psychiatry at St. Margaret's Hospital, who had been serving a federal prison sentence for her role in coordinating illegal human experimentation. "Mr. Vale," the letter began, "I know that nothing I can say will excuse my participation in crimes that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. But I want you to know that Dr. Chen spoke about you often during her final months at the hospital. She believed that someone like you, someone who had been failed by the systems designed to help veterans, would eventually find the evidence she was preserving and would have the courage to ensure it reached people who could act on it." Dr. Hawthorne went on to explain that she had provided information to federal prosecutors about other medical facilities where similar programs might be operating, and that she was working to establish educational programs within the federal prison system to help other medical professionals understand how institutional pressure could corrupt their ethical judgment. Dr. Chen died believing that the truth would eventually emerge, the letter concluded. "Your courage in ensuring that her sacrifice wasn't meaningless has given me hope that medical professionals can learn from our failures and commit themselves to preventing similar violations in the future." The letter was a reminder that even within systematic institutional corruption, individual people could choose to resist, could choose to preserve evidence of crimes, could choose to prioritize human dignity over personal safety. Dr. Chen had made that choice when she documented the Meridian Project's operations despite knowing the personal risks involved. Marcus had made that choice when he carried her evidence out of a collapsing hospital and into the hands of people who could act on it. As Marcus reflected on the journey that had taken him from homelessness to becoming a guardian of one of the most important human rights revelations in American history, he realized that his experience embodied both the failures and the possibilities of democratic institutions. The same systems that had abandoned him as a homeless veteran had eventually provided the frameworks for exposing and punishing systematic human rights violations. The key difference had been the presence of individuals within those systems who were willing to prioritize truth over institutional loyalty, who were willing to risk their careers and their safety to ensure that evidence of crimes reached people who could act on it. Dr. Chen, Rebecca Martinez, Dr. Reeves, the congressional staff members who had demanded oversight hearings, the prosecutors who had pursued criminal charges despite political pressure, all of them had chosen to trust in the possibility that democratic institutions could be reformed rather than simply endured. The Meridian Project's exposure had not solved the underlying problems that made such programs possible. Institutional secrecy, corporate capture of regulatory agencies, intelligence operations that operated beyond democratic oversight. But it had demonstrated that those problems could be challenged, that evidence of systematic abuse could survive attempts at cover-up, and that justice, however imperfect and delayed, remained possible within American legal and political systems. Marcus's testimony before the final congressional hearing on Meridian Project reforms focused on the importance of protecting and supporting potential whistleblowers who might discover evidence of future institutional crimes. His experience had taught him that the people most likely to stumble across evidence of systematic abuse were often those who had already been marginalized by the same systems that were committing the crimes. Homeless veterans, psychiatric patients, undocumented immigrants, people with addiction disorders. These are the populations most likely to witness institutional abuse because they're the populations most likely to be targeted for it, Marcus explained to the Congressional Committee. But they're also the populations least likely to be believed when they try to report what they've witnessed. Creating effective accountability systems requires taking seriously the testimony of people who have been systematically excluded from institutional power. The hearing room was packed with Meridian Project survivors, their families, medical professionals, legal advocates, and journalists who had covered the story from its initial revelation through the complex legal proceedings that had followed. Marcus could see Dr. Chen's photograph displayed among the memorial materials that honored the researchers and activists who had died trying to expose systematic human rights violations. But he could also see the faces of survivors who were reclaiming their lives after years of psychological programming, families who were reuniting after being torn apart by systematic manipulation, communities that were healing from the damage inflicted by institutional abuse. The legacy of Dr. Chen's sacrifice was measured not just in criminal convictions and financial settlements, but in the restoration of human dignity to people who had been treated as expendable assets in pursuit of strategic objectives. As the hearing concluded and Marcus prepared to return to his work advocating for Meridian survivors, he felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with honoring the courage of people who had died trying to protect others from systematic harm. Dr. Chen's evidence had survived. Her questions had been answered, and her commitment to human dignity had become the foundation for reforms that would protect future generations from similar abuse. The abandoned hospital where Marcus's journey had begun was now a memorial park, its grounds transformed into a space for reflection and remembrance. A bronze plaque near the park's entrance bore Dr. Chen's words, "Some truths are too important to be buried with their discoverers." Below that inscription, visitors could find information about the Meridian Project, resources for survivors of psychological conditioning, and contact information for organizations that provide support for whistleblowers who discover evidence of institutional abuse.
Marcus and Ranger visited the memorial regularly, often accompanied by survivors who were undergoing treatment to reverse their psychological programming. The park had become a gathering place for people who understood that healing required not just individual therapy, but collective commitment to preventing similar crimes in the future. Standing in the shadow of trees that had been planted where St. Margaret's Hospital once concealed its secrets, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had taken him from desperate homelessness to becoming a guardian of democratic accountability. The path had been marked by loss, trauma, and systematic abandonment, but also by moments of profound human connection and institutional redemption. Dr. Chen had trusted that someone would eventually find her evidence and have the courage to ensure it reached people who could act on it. That trust had been vindicated, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for a network of individuals committed to protecting vulnerable populations from institutional exploitation.
The Meridian Project had been exposed, its perpetrators prosecuted, and its survivors supported in their recovery. But the deeper legacy was the demonstration that democratic institutions, however imperfect and compromised, retained the capacity for self-correction when individuals within those institutions chose to prioritize human dignity over institutional loyalty. Dr. Chen's sacrifice had not been meaningless, and neither had the suffering of the hundreds of people who had been subjected to systematic psychological abuse. Justice had been served, healing was underway, and the truth that had been buried beneath tons of rubble and years of systematic cover-up had finally emerged into the light, where it could serve its intended purpose, preventing future crimes by ensuring that past crimes were neither forgotten nor forgiven. 5 years after the night Marcus Vale first sought shelter in an abandoned hospital, he stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University's School of Medicine, delivering the annual Dr. Sarah Chen Memorial Lecture on Medical Ethics and Human Rights. The podium bore a small plaque with Chen's photograph, a young woman with kind eyes and the determined expression of someone who had understood that some principles were worth dying to defend. Ranger, now graying around the muzzle, but still alert and dignified, lay beside the lectern in a specially designed bed that had become as familiar a sight at Marcus's speaking engagements as the man himself. The dog's presence served as a living reminder that loyalty and courage could emerge from the most unlikely partnerships, that survival often depended on the bonds formed between broken souls who chose to heal together rather than suffer alone. Dr. Chen believed that medical professionals had a special obligation to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation, Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of testimony before congressional committees, international human rights tribunals, and medical review boards. She understood that the same knowledge that could heal could also be weaponized, that the trust patients placed in medical institutions could be betrayed in ways that caused damage extending far beyond individual suffering. The audience included medical students, established physicians, ethicists, legal scholars, and survivors of various forms of institutional abuse who had found inspiration in the story of how evidence preserved by a dead researcher had ultimately brought justice to hundreds of victims. Among them sat Rebecca Martinez, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose coverage of the Meridian Project had established new standards for investigating government accountability. Dr. Michael Reeves occupied a front-row seat, his hair now completely white, but his commitment to healing trauma survivors as strong as ever. Marcus's journey from homeless veteran to internationally recognized advocate for whistleblower protection and victims' rights had been chronicled in documentaries, academic papers, and policy studies that examined how institutional failures could be transformed into systematic reforms. But he preferred to focus on the individuals whose lives had been changed by the courage of people like Dr. Chen, who had chosen truth over safety, justice over survival.
The Meridian Project was possible because it targeted people who had already been abandoned by the systems designed to protect them, Marcus continued, his words carrying the weight of personal experience that no amount of academic study could replicate. Homeless veterans, psychiatric patients, undocumented immigrants, people struggling with addiction, populations that society had already decided were expendable, whose suffering could be ignored or explained away as the natural consequence of personal failures rather than systematic neglect. The Chen Memorial Treatment Center had expanded beyond its original mission of helping Meridian Project survivors, becoming a comprehensive facility for treating various forms of psychological conditioning and institutional trauma. The techniques developed by Dr. Reeves and his team had proven effective for survivors of cult programming, human trafficking, domestic violence, and other situations where individual autonomy had been systematically destroyed through sophisticated psychological manipulation.
The center's success had inspired similar facilities in 12 countries, creating an international network of medical professionals who specialized in detecting and treating involuntary mental programming. The work was complex, requiring months or years of careful therapeutic intervention to safely dismantle psychological structures that had been implanted in victims' minds. But the results were transformative. People who had spent years believing they were mentally ill discovered that their symptoms were actually evidence of systematic torture, and with proper treatment, they could reclaim their authentic identities and psychological autonomy. Marcus had become the public face of this movement, but he never forgot that his role was to amplify the voices of people like Dr. Chen, who had made the ultimate sacrifice to preserve evidence of institutional crimes. Every speech he delivered, every interview he granted, every congressional hearing where he testified was an opportunity to ensure that her questions continued to demand answers, that her commitment to human dignity continued to inspire medical professionals who face pressure to prioritize institutional loyalty over patient welfare. The financial settlement from the Meridian Project lawsuits had provided Marcus with resources he had never imagined possessing during his years of homelessness. The modest house he shared with Ranger in a quiet Washington, D.C. neighborhood represented security and stability that felt almost surreal after years of survival on society's margins. But the money's real value lay in the independence it provided, the ability to speak truth to power without fear of economic retaliation, the resources to support other whistleblowers who discovered evidence of institutional abuse but lacked the resources to safely expose their discoveries. The Marcus Vale Foundation, established with funds from his legal settlement, provided financial support, legal protection, and security services for individuals who possessed evidence of systematic human rights violations but lacked the resources to safely expose their discoveries. The foundation had assisted 43 whistleblowers in the 5 years since its establishment, helping to expose corruption in government agencies, corporate malfeasance in pharmaceutical companies, and abuse in military contracting operations. The lesson of the Meridian Project is not that government institutions are inherently evil, but that unchecked power inevitably leads to systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The same institutions that abandoned me as a homeless veteran eventually provided the framework for exposing and punishing crimes against hundreds of people. The difference was the presence of individuals within those institutions who were willing to prioritize human dignity over institutional convenience. Among the audience members were former Meridian Project survivors who had reclaimed their lives after years of psychological programming. David Kowalski, the Army medic who had been conditioned to destroy evidence of VA medical misconduct, now worked as a patient advocate, helping other veterans navigate the complex bureaucracy of military medical services. Patricia Donnelly, the environmental activist who had been discredited through systematic psychological manipulation, had resumed her work fighting corporate pollution while also serving on the board of directors for the Chen Memorial Treatment Center. Their presence was a testament to the resilience of human consciousness, the capacity for recovery that existed even after the most sophisticated forms of mental conditioning. Dr. Reeves had documented the healing process in academic papers that advanced understanding of neuroplasticity and trauma recovery. But Marcus preferred to focus on the human stories, people who had reclaimed their ability to love, to trust, to make decisions based on their own values rather than programming implanted by institutions that had treated them as expendable assets. The memorial park that had been built on the site of St. Margaret's Hospital had become a pilgrimage destination for survivors of institutional abuse from around the world. The bronze plaque bearing Dr. Chen's words, "Some truths are too important to be buried with their discoverers," had been photographed and shared millions of times on social media, becoming a rallying cry for individuals who possessed evidence of systematic corruption but were struggling to find the courage to come forward. The park's walking paths were lined with plaques honoring other researchers, journalists, and activists who had died trying to expose various forms of institutional abuse. Dr. Karen Silkwood, the nuclear plant worker who had discovered evidence of safety violations before dying in a suspicious car accident. Gary Webb, the journalist who had exposed CIA connections to drug trafficking before being found dead under circumstances that raised questions about suicide versus assassination. Aaron Swartz, the internet activist who had committed suicide while facing federal prosecution for attempting to make academic research freely available to the public. Each plaque told a story of individual courage confronting institutional power, of people who had chosen to risk their lives rather than allow systematic abuse to continue in secrecy. The memorial served as a reminder that the exposure of the Meridian Project had been possible only because it built upon foundations laid by previous generations of truth-tellers who had been willing to sacrifice their safety for the possibility of justice. Marcus often brought visiting survivors to the memorial, using the stories of past whistleblowers to help people understand that their own discoveries of institutional abuse were part of a larger historical pattern of resistance to systematic corruption. The visit always concluded at Dr. Chen's memorial stone, where Marcus would explain how a young psychiatric resident's ethical concerns had ultimately led to the exposure of one of the most extensive human rights violations in American history. She never knew that her notes would survive her death, Marcus would tell visitors, his hand resting on Ranger's head as the dog sat patiently beside Chen's memorial. She documented everything with the hope that someone might eventually find the evidence and have the courage to act on it. Her trust in the possibility of justice, even when she couldn't see how that justice might be achieved, is what made everything else possible. The international impact of the Meridian Project revelations had extended far beyond American borders, inspiring investigations of similar programs in countries where intelligence agencies had been experimenting with psychological conditioning techniques. The European Parliament had established a permanent committee on institutional abuse prevention. The United Nations had created new protocols for monitoring medical research conducted on vulnerable populations. International criminal courts had developed new frameworks for prosecuting crimes involving systematic psychological manipulation. But Marcus knew that institutional reforms were only as strong as the individuals charged with implementing them, and that new forms of systematic abuse would inevitably emerge as technology advanced and power structures evolved. The real legacy of Dr. Chen's sacrifice lay not in specific policy changes, but in the networks of people who had been inspired by her example to prioritize human dignity over institutional loyalty, to choose truth over safety when those choices became necessary. The Chen Memorial Lecture had become an annual tradition, but Marcus's most meaningful work happened in smaller settings: counseling sessions with trauma survivors, strategy meetings with potential whistleblowers, quiet conversations with medical students who were struggling to maintain their ethical principles within institutional cultures that rewarded compliance over conscience. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a young psychiatric resident at Walter Reed Medical Center, had approached Marcus after one such conversation, carrying documentation of experimental treatments being administered to combat veterans without proper informed consent protocols. The procedures weren't as extensive as the Meridian Project's psychological conditioning programs, but they represented the same fundamental disregard for patient autonomy that had enabled systematic human rights violations. "I keep thinking about Dr. Chen," Dr. Walsh had explained, during their meeting in the secure conference room that Marcus maintained for sensitive discussions. She raised concerns about dosage discrepancies, and when she didn't get satisfactory answers, she kept digging until she found evidence of systematic abuse. "I'm seeing the same pattern of evasive responses when I ask questions about these experimental protocols." Marcus had helped Dr. Walsh connect with the network of legal advocates, journalists, and medical ethicists who specialized in investigating institutional abuse. The investigation was still ongoing, but early findings suggested that several military medical facilities were conducting research that violated established consent protocols, potentially affecting thousands of service members who believed they were receiving standard treatment for PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. The Meridian Project wasn't unique because it was evil, Marcus had explained to Dr. Walsh. It was unique because it got exposed. Similar programs are probably operating right now in facilities around the world, hidden behind national security classifications and medical research exemptions. The question isn't whether systematic abuse is happening. The question is whether people like us will have the courage to document it and bring it to light when we discover it. The conversation with Dr. Walsh reminded Marcus that his work was far from finished, that the exposure of the Meridian Project had been a victory in an ongoing war rather than a final resolution of the problems that made such programs possible. Each new generation of medical professionals, government officials, and corporate executives would face the same choices between individual conscience and institutional pressure that had confronted Dr. Chen and her colleagues. As Marcus concluded his lecture at Georgetown University, he looked out at an audience that included many people who would face those choices in their own careers. Medical students who would someday work in hospitals where administrators prioritize profits over patient care. Future government employees who might discover evidence of illegal surveillance programs or human rights violations. Young journalists who would have opportunities to expose corruption or cover it up depending on the pressures they faced from editors, advertisers, and government officials. Dr. Chen's legacy isn't just the Meridian Project survivors who received justice. Her legacy is the demonstration that individual conscience can triumph over systematic corruption, that evidence of crimes can survive attempts at cover-up, and that institutions can be forced to reform when enough people choose truth over safety. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but Marcus knew that applause was meaningless without the individual commitments that would determine how audience members responded when they encountered evidence of institutional abuse in their own professional lives. The real measure of Dr. Chen's legacy would be found in the choices made by people who had been inspired by her example to prioritize human dignity over personal security. After the lecture, Marcus and Ranger walked through the Georgetown campus toward the Potomac River, where they often concluded public appearances with a quiet reflection on how far they had traveled from the desperate night when they had sought shelter in an abandoned hospital. The cherry trees along the riverbank were beginning to bloom, their pale pink flowers creating a canopy of beauty that reminded Marcus of the possibility for renewal that existed even in the wake of systematic trauma. Ranger, despite his advancing age, still enjoyed these walks, though he moved more slowly now and required frequent rest stops. The dog's presence had been a constant source of comfort throughout Marcus's transformation from homeless veteran to internationally recognized advocate. And Marcus knew that their time together was becoming increasingly precious. But he also knew that the bond they had forged during their darkest period had created something larger than their individual survival. A story of loyalty and courage that had inspired countless people to believe that healing was possible, even after the most profound betrayals of trust.
The evening news was dominated by stories about the latest congressional hearings on institutional abuse prevention, legislative proposals for enhanced whistleblower protections, and international efforts to establish binding protocols for medical research involving vulnerable populations. The Meridian Project had become a touchstone for discussions about government accountability, corporate responsibility, and the protection of human rights in an era of advancing surveillance technology and psychological manipulation techniques. But Marcus preferred to measure progress in more personal terms. The letters he received from trauma survivors who had found the courage to seek treatment, the phone calls from potential whistleblowers who had decided to document evidence of institutional abuse, the messages from medical students who had been inspired to prioritize patient welfare over institutional pressure. Dr. Chen's photograph occupied a place of honor in Marcus's home office, surrounded by awards, commendations, and letters of gratitude from people whose lives had been changed by the evidence she had preserved. But the most meaningful item in the room was a simple handwritten note from Patricia Donnelly, the environmental activist whose programming had been reversed through Dr. Reeves' treatment protocols. Thank you for ensuring that Dr. Chen's sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Because of your courage, I remember who I used to be, and I'm learning who I can become. As Marcus prepared for bed in the home that had been purchased from funds from his legal settlement, he reflected on the strange trajectory that had taken him from desperate homelessness to comfortable security, from systematic abandonment to international recognition. The journey had been marked by profound loss and unexpected grace, by the discovery that human dignity could survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. Ranger settled onto his bed beside Marcus's own, the dogs breathing steady and peaceful in the way that indicated complete trust in their shared safety. They had survived together, healed together, and found purpose together in work that honored the courage of people who had chosen truth over survival when those choices became necessary. Outside their bedroom window, Washington, D.C. continued its restless existence as the center of American political power, where new conspiracies were probably being hatched even as old ones were being exposed and punished. The work of protecting vulnerable populations from institutional abuse would never be finished, would never be complete, would always require the vigilance of individuals who understood that freedom demanded the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of personal consequences. But tonight, in a quiet house shared with a loyal companion who had taught him that healing was possible even after the most profound betrayals, Marcus Vale slept peacefully, knowing that Dr. Sarah Chen's questions had been answered, that her sacrifice had achieved the justice she had died trying to secure, and that her legacy would continue to inspire future generations of people who believed that some truths were too important to be buried with their discoverers. The memorial park that had been built on the site of St. Margaret's Hospital remained illuminated throughout the night, its pathways lit by solar-powered lamps that had been installed as a symbol of sustainable enlightenment. The bronze plaque bearing Dr. Chen's words caught the moonlight, reflecting her message across the darkness toward a future where institutional power would be constrained by individual conscience, where systematic abuse would be prevented by people who chose courage over comfort, and where the truth would always find a way to survive those who would bury it. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the memorial park was empty, except for the occasional security patrol and the small animals that had reclaimed the space for their own purposes, Dr. Chen's words continued their vigil. Some truths are too important to be buried with their discoverers. The message had survived demolition,
cover-up, and systematic attempts at erasure, because it embodied a principle that transcended individual mortality, that human dignity was worth defending regardless of personal cost, and that justice, however delayed and imperfect, remained possible as long as people were willing to risk their safety to preserve evidence of institutional crimes. The story of Marcus Vale and Ranger, of Dr. Sarah Chen and the Meridian Project survivors, had become part of the larger narrative of resistance to systematic oppression that stretched back through generations of people who had chosen conscience over compliance. Their specific struggles had ended. Their immediate battles had been won. But their example continued to illuminate the path forward for others who would face similar choices between safety and truth, between personal security and collective justice. The dawn that broke over Washington, D.C. on the 5th anniversary of Marcus's first night in St. Margaret's Hospital brought with it the promise of another day in which individual conscience could triumph over institutional corruption, in which evidence of systematic abuse could be preserved and acted upon, in which the courage of people like Dr. Chen could inspire others to believe that some fights were worth the ultimate sacrifice. The memorial park awakened with the sunrise, its pathways gradually filling with joggers, dog walkers, and commuters, who began their days surrounded by reminders that democracy required the active participation of citizens who understood that freedom was not a guarantee, but a responsibility that each generation had to earn through its willingness to confront systematic abuse whenever and wherever it emerged. And somewhere in that morning crowd, perhaps among the medical students hurrying to their classes or the government employees heading to their offices, walked the next generation of potential whistleblowers who would someday face their own moments of choice between institutional loyalty and human dignity. Dr. Chen's memorial stood ready to remind them that such choices, however difficult and dangerous, were also opportunities to participate in the ongoing work of justice, to ensure that truth would always find a way to survive those who would bury it, and to demonstrate that some principles were indeed too important to be abandoned for personal safety.
The story continued, as it always had and always would, in the hearts and minds of people who understood that the price of freedom was the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of consequences. Dr. Sarah Chen's legacy lived on, not just in the survivors who had been healed and the criminals who had been punished, but in the eternal principle that human dignity was worth defending, whatever the cost. If this story opened your eyes to something you never knew existed, show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing for more investigations that uncover the truth that they don't want you to know. A decade after discovering Dr. Sarah Chen's hidden laboratory beneath St. Margaret's Hospital, Marcus Vale stood in the memorial park that now occupied the site, reflecting on his extraordinary transformation from homeless veteran to international human rights advocate. The autumn morning reminded him of that pivotal day when he and his loyal companion Ranger first sought shelter in the abandoned hospital, unknowingly stumbling upon evidence that would expose one of the most extensive government abuse programs in modern history. Ranger had passed away 3 years ago, his respiratory system finally succumbing to damage from their years on the streets. The veterinarian attributed his death to those harsh conditions, though Marcus knew the aging dog had lived far longer than expected when they first discovered that fateful laboratory. The grief was profound but manageable.
Marcus had learned that healing from loss required the same patience and determination that had enabled their survival through systematic abandonment. The Marcus Vale Foundation had evolved into an international organization operating in 12 countries, providing comprehensive support for whistleblowers and survivors of institutional abuse. The work continued under principles that Ranger had helped Marcus understand during their darkest nights, that loyalty transcends convenience and courage emerges from bonds between broken souls choosing to heal together. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the young psychiatric resident who first approached Marcus with concerns about experimental treatments at Walter Reed, now directed the Foundation's Medical Oversight Division. Her investigation had ultimately exposed a network of military medical facilities conducting unauthorized research on combat veterans, resulting in criminal prosecutions, medical reforms, and compensation for over 2,000 service members who had been subjected to experimental procedures without proper consent. The Foundation's scope had expanded far beyond investigating government programs to include corporate medical research, pharmaceutical company practices, and international trafficking networks exploiting vulnerable populations for various forms of experimentation. Each case followed the template established by Dr. Chen's documentation of the Meridian Project: meticulous evidence collection, careful coalition building, and coordinated public revelation designed to generate protective publicity for victims and witnesses. Marcus had testified before the International Criminal Court in The Hague, sharing expertise about psychological conditioning techniques discovered in conflicts across Africa, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. The same technology developed to control American psychiatric patients was being exported to intelligence agencies and military contractors worldwide, creating a global network of institutions trading in techniques for manipulating human consciousness. The Chen Memorial Treatment Center had become a model for trauma recovery programs worldwide, with affiliated facilities operating in 37 countries. Dr. Michael Reeves, now in his 70s but still actively treating patients, had trained hundreds of therapists in techniques for reversing psychological conditioning. The success rates were remarkable. Over 80% of patients showed significant improvement within 18 months, with many achieving complete recovery of their preconditioning personalities and memories.
The research had applications beyond treating government experimentation victims. Therapeutic protocols developed for Meridian Project survivors proved effective for various forms of complex trauma, from childhood abuse to cult programming to psychological effects of human trafficking. The center's work advanced understanding of consciousness, memory, and identity in ways that benefited millions of patients worldwide. The Foundation's files contained evidence of systematic human rights violations involving dozens of government agencies, hundreds of medical facilities, and thousands of victims across every continent. Each case represented individual suffering inflicted in service of institutional objectives that treated human consciousness as a strategic resource to be exploited rather than a sacred trust to be protected. However, the files also documented resistance, researchers who refused to participate in unethical experiments, medical professionals who documented evidence of abuse despite personal risks, administrators who chose transparency over institutional loyalty. The pattern established by Dr. Chen's courage had inspired countless individuals to prioritize human dignity over personal security, creating a global network committed to preventing systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The memorial park had expanded to include monuments honoring whistleblowers, researchers, and activists from around the world who died trying to expose institutional crimes.
Dr. Chen's original bronze plaque remained the centerpiece, now surrounded by testimonials from survivors, research findings from treatment programs, and interactive exhibits educating visitors about techniques for detecting and preventing systematic abuse. The Foundation's educational programs reached over 50,000 students annually, teaching recognition techniques for institutional abuse, legal frameworks for protecting whistleblowers, and ethical principles for medical research involving vulnerable populations. The curriculum had been adopted by medical schools, journalism programs, and government training academies wanting to ensure graduates understood both temptations and consequences of participating in systematic human rights violations. Legal reforms inspired by the Meridian Project had been enacted in 43 countries, creating new protections for research subjects, enhanced oversight mechanisms for government-funded medical programs, and international protocols for prosecuting crimes involving systematic psychological manipulation. Though imperfect and compromised by political realities, these reforms represented significant progress toward the accountability Dr. Chen died trying to achieve. The Foundation's Victim Services Division provided comprehensive support for institutional abuse survivors, medical treatment, legal advocacy, financial assistance, and psychological counseling designed to address complex trauma resulting from systematic betrayal of trust. The program served over 3,000 individuals annually, from Meridian Project survivors still recovering from conditioning to recent victims of corporate medical research fraud. The most recent investigation involved a network of private military contractors conducting psychological experiments on migrant detention center populations using techniques refined from original Meridian Project research. The 18-month investigation exposed systematic abuse affecting over 8,000 individuals, leading to criminal prosecutions, facility closures, and victim compensation. As Marcus prepared to transition from active leadership, now in his 60s, he recognized the work-needed energy younger advocates could provide more effectively. He reflected on his extraordinary journey from desperate homelessness to international recognition as a guardian of democratic accountability. Dr. Jennifer Walsh would assume executive leadership, while Marcus remained as chairman emeritus, focusing on mentoring relationships and strategic guidance for complex investigations. The Foundation's board had unanimously approved the Marcus Vale Fellowship Program, providing financial support and professional development for young advocates specializing in investigating institutional abuse. The program would train a new generation in techniques pioneered during the Meridian Project investigation, ensuring expertise would survive and evolve as new forms of systematic abuse emerged. During the ceremony marking Marcus's transition, held in the Memorial Park beneath trees that had grown tall in soil where St. Margaret's Hospital once concealed its secrets, hundreds gathered. Survivors of systematic abuse, researchers who exposed institutional crimes, journalists trained in coalition-based investigation techniques, and legal advocates specializing in protecting vulnerable populations. Dr. Chen's memorial stone was decorated with flowers from survivors worldwide, representing dozens of countries and cultures, but expressing universal recognition that some principles transcend national boundaries, political systems, and institutional loyalties. Dr. Chen believed that individual conscience could triumph over systematic corruption, Marcus said during his farewell address. She demonstrated that principle through her willingness to document evidence of crimes even when she couldn't see how that evidence might eventually reach people capable of seeking justice. Her legacy lives not in specific policy reforms or criminal prosecutions, but in the networks of people inspired by her example to prioritize human dignity over institutional convenience. Standing alone beside Dr. Chen's memorial stone as the ceremony concluded, Marcus read her words once more. Some truths are too important to be buried with their discoverers.
These words had guided him through investigations revealing institutional behavior's darkest aspects, through legal proceedings exposing systematic human rights violations, through building coalitions sufficient to challenge institutions operating above the law for decades. The Memorial Park's solar-powered lamps began their nightly illumination, creating a constellation of remembrance that would burn throughout the night, guiding visitors who came to honor those who chose truth over safety when such choices became necessary. The memorial would endure long after all Meridian Project investigation participants had passed away, serving as a reminder that systematic abuse could be exposed, justice achieved, and individual conscience could triumph over institutional corruption when enough people chose principle over convenience. Dr. Chen's sacrifice had not been meaningless. It had become the foundation for transformative change, protecting countless individuals from systematic abuse that powerful institutions once believed they could commit with impunity. The work continued, as it always had and always would, in the hearts and minds of people understanding that freedom's price was the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of consequences. Dr. Chen's legacy lived on, eternal and indestructible, in the principle that human dignity was worth defending, whatever the cost.